For the second time in its history, the US is poised to lose another war against China. But this time, the entire current world order is at stake. During the Korean War, the influx of hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops surprised American and NATO military planners who were caught completely off guard. While the US technically did not lose against China, in fact it scored truly apocalyptic losses on Chinese infantry, the US also didn't win the war, resulting in the current status quo on the peninsula. South Korea remains a strong US ally and economically powerful liberal democracy, while Kim Jong-un rules the north and hurls missiles into the ocean to keep Godzilla at bay. Sure, some of you will claim there's no such thing as Godzilla and Kim's just a madman developing a nuclear weapons program, but riddle us this: why hasn't there been a single confirmed Godzilla sighting since North Korea began launching missiles into the Pacific? This time the US and China are set to go head-to-head in a war that will absolutely dwarf the clash between the US and Chinese troops in Korea. And this one's for all the marbles, boys and girls, because the victor is guaranteed to shape the 21st century. If the US wins, the global status quo will remain the same. If China wins, an autocratic world order will almost certainly replace the current liberal one. And if it doesn't, it'll hurl the world into a fresh ideological conflict that'll make the Cold War look like the Anglo-Zanzibar War. This might sound like a lot of hyperbole, but the truth is the US and China represent two completely different visions for the global future. The United States is the dominant global power, and it certainly has its flaws. But it's a train that can be steered and course-corrected, with the historical global trend being toward a more liberal world order. China's very survival depends on upending liberal democracies who represent an existential threat to the iron grip of the Chinese Communist Party. Already, the difficulties of assimilating Hong Kong and Macau into the mainland communist government hint at a China where people are increasingly growing tired of the CCP's yoke. Eliminating all other alternatives altogether is one way to placate the masses. The linchpin of Chinese ambitions to break the US-led world order rests with Taiwan. And unfortunately for the US, that means China has all the advantages. This little island nation played a relatively minor role throughout the 20th century, but it's set to define the 21st century and beyond. The island nation is just offshore mainland China and enjoys a robust, healthy democracy that thrives even under the long, dark shadow of the Chinese Communist Party. China believes that the breakaway republic still belongs in the fold of the CCP and has repeatedly stated it will use force to reunify. Continued independence is simply not an option. So the die is cast, and an invasion seems inevitable. But why does the fate of this little island matter to the world? For one, Taiwan enjoys the protection of what's come to be called the Silicon Shield. Back in the 80s, as the US moved the manufacturing of microchips overseas where they could be produced more cheaply, Taiwan saw an opportunity. The nation invested heavily into building infrastructure to produce semiconductors and soon became a world leader in manufacturing them. With the United States Navy being the most powerful force on Earth, there was little concern over a hostile China next door to the world's largest supply of computer chips. But that calculus has changed, and where once the US could sail its carrier strike groups right past Chinese shores with no concerns, now it has to face a rapidly modernizing and expanding Chinese military. This puts Taiwan in serious jeopardy, and with it, the world's largest supplier of the most advanced computer chips on the planet. With the CCP in control of Taiwan's semiconductor production, it'll have the leverage to blackmail any nation it wishes, even America. Under threat of sanction, nations will have to carefully weigh how they respond to the CCP requests, or watch their economy crumble for a lack of computer chips. We've had a taste of this future with the shortage prompted by the COVID crisis, which for many was a wake-up call to the threat the world order currently faces. Secondly, Taiwan is part of the First Island Chain, a string of islands stretching from Japan through Taiwan and down to the Philippines and beyond. This chain of pro-US nations acts as a barrier and historically has contained the communist powers of the Soviet Union and China. This has left the US Navy as the guarantor of global trade security, and it's thanks to the US naval dominance that the world enjoys free, predictable, and stable trade for the first time in history. China breaking this First Island Chain shifts global power dramatically, as its warships will be able to freely come and go as they please and maneuver strategically important waterways, like the Malacca Straits, where if they so choose they can influence global trade as they wish. With Taiwan as the linchpin of any war between the US and China, this unfortunately leaves China with all the advantages, or at least most of them, because China is making one key error. Faced with the prospect of the United States effectively containing its forces via the First Island Chain, China has two options. The first is to attempt to break the chain militarily, as we seem to be on an inevitable course for. The second, however, is to break the chain diplomatically. Rather than expend military resources and capital in a confrontation with the US and its allies, China could leverage its massive economy and turn it into diplomatic pressure. For its part, China's attempted to do this. It alone holds the leash on North Korea, and it has pursued much closer economic ties with nations in Southeast Asia. This leaves South Korea's fate unknown in case the US and China go to war. Once it would have been a steadfast ally to the US, but its defense treaty with the United States does not compel it to go to war over Taiwan with its ally. With China already punishing South Korea economically over the deployment of US THAAD ballistic missile defenses on its soil in 2017, South Korea may not be looking to break its relationship with such a huge trading partner. And if South Korea reneges on its defensive partnership with the US over Taiwan, the American people may find themselves questioning why they've invested so much in defending the South for 70 years. But with other US partners, China's been far less successful. In fact, it's made some seriously egregious missteps. Once it looked set to spin Australia away from US influence with a robust charm offensive, which came to a crashing halt when the Australians discovered how deeply China had penetrated Australian political and educational institutions. China had been secretly working to influence the Australian youth and politics alike to be pro-CCP, and its continued aggression in the South China Sea was seen as an inevitable threat to Australian interests. When Australia called for an investigation into the origin of COVID, which looked into evidence of the virus being man-made and leaked in a lab by China, relations soured even further, leading to a trade war between the two nations. It's with the Philippines, though, that China's misstepped the most, and it could have just handed the US the keys to victory. Much like in Australia, China also waged a charm offensive against the Philippines and heavily courted the nation's last president, Rodrigo Duterte. Duterte was a populist autocrat who came to power on promises to crack down on violent crime and drugs. To his credit, he did just that by launching one of the largest campaigns of police brutality and abuse of the modern era. The International Criminal Court is currently considering an investigation into Duterte's campaign against crime and drugs based on reported hundreds of extrajudicial killings and even more beatings during his reign. Duterte also cracked down on political opposition as best he could, given that the Philippines was still a democracy, much to his chagrin. In short, Duterte was the kind of man China could do business with, a fellow autocrat with deeply anti-democratic sentiments. Relations between the US and the Philippines soured during this time, as US President Barack Obama called out Duterte for the extrajudicial killings that he was overseeing during his campaign against crime. The Philippines and China began to grow closer, and the future of the US-Filipino defensive alliance was in serious question. This would have been a disaster for the balance of power in the Pacific, effectively allowing China to break a large chunk of the First Island chain without firing a shot. Even more importantly, it denied the US one thing it needs the most: bases close to China. This is America's biggest weakness in the Pacific. While China can base all air and naval power at once right on its own shores, the US is forced to fight an entire ocean away from its home. This severely limits the amount of firepower the US can bring to a fight, as well as complicating logistics and slowing down the pace and intensity of combat operations. Traditionally, the US has relied on regional allies to give it the geography from which to fight from, leveling the playing field against any Pacific threat. It's known as the tyranny of distance in the US defense circles, and America has invested heavily in neutralizing this significant deficiency. Now the stage was set for China to completely upset US Pacific strategy and perhaps open the door to victory in Taiwan and beyond. But China overstepped and misstepped, both. First, it failed to significantly influence Filipino elections after Duterte's final term, and the nation voted in favor of Ferdinand Bongbong Romualdez Marcos Jr., or simply Bongbong Marcos. Marcos is the son of renowned Filipino dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr., who ruled the country with an iron fist from 1965 to 1986. He was known for being grossly corrupt and eliminating any political opposition. But don't worry, the apple definitely fell far from the tree on this one, or so the entire world hopes. Though in truth, it's not exactly out of America's character to openly support dictators when it's strategically convenient. When it isn't anymore, well then it's time to get democratized, baby. Marcos's victory was a disaster for China. The Philippines' new president was a staunch US ally, and it sees China as an existential threat not just to the Philippines, but the greater South Pacific region. For his part, Marcos would probably be a lot less outraged at China if the nation hadn't been illegally building military bases in other people's territorial waters. The US has been criticized for neocolonialism, Yet, China is just doing things the old-fashioned way and taking territory by force. Under international law, every nation has an exclusive claim to waters a set distance from its shores. This can lead to conflict in places like the South China Sea, with so many different nations so close together. Citing post-World War II maps and claims that its sailing vessels have historically moved through those waters, China's laid claim to literally the entire South China Sea. And a quick look on the map reveals that China is in no way anywhere near its claims. China claims basically all of Vietnamese waters, half of the Philippines, and large chunks of Malaysia, Brunei, and beyond. China's claims include waters as much as 1,000 miles away from its own shores. This would be like the United States claiming basically all of Russia's Arctic coastline from Alaska, or all of the Philippines' west coast and most of Indonesia and Papua New Guinea's north coast from Guam. The 9-dash line has its origin in 1946, when Mao Zedong had drawn a map that suddenly showed the entire South China Sea as belonging to China because, well, why not? Unsurprisingly, affected nations laughed China's claims away, given that these waters were critical for their own economies. They kept on laughing until the 90s, when China's growing naval might suddenly became significantly less funny. China regularly sent Coast Guard vessels with actual military vessels in the distance to harass the fishing fleets of other nations. It also began to build up artificial islands from which to project power, and today has established multiple bases commonly referred to as unsinkable aircraft carriers in the region. Now, nobody's laughing anymore, and China's bullying has extended to capsizing other nation ships, and in the case of Vietnam, simply moving their oil drilling wells right into Vietnamese territorial waters. In 2020, China sunk a Vietnamese fishing boat with 8 men on board for fishing near the Paracel Islands, and in 2014 it carried out a similar attack captured on video. China has also used its much larger vessels to intimidate and harass oil exploration vessels from other countries. China has started to shut other nations off of the energy and fish wealth of the South China Sea. The region's also estimated to contain one of the largest untapped oil and gas reserves in the world. So maintaining control of the waters China is contesting is becoming more and more vital. Filipino fishermen who made their living fishing off of reefs, now regularly patrolled by hostile Chinese vessels, began to feel the economic pain. To reinforce its own territorial claims, the Philippines began to station Marines on various reefs, or even floating wrecks, with China regularly ramming supply vessels or using water cannons to keep them away from resupplying their troops. The attacks slowed significantly during the Duterte years, but have now resumed with the election of Bongbong Marcos, and Marcos has had enough. Marcos made multiple military bases available for U.S. forces shortly after coming to power. This was a major win for the U.S., as it expanded its ability to station air power in the region, a chief concern for combating China in the Pacific. This only intensified China's efforts to bully Filipino vessels in the South China Sea, with the most recent incident including China erecting a floating barrier to keep Filipino fishermen out of a disputed reef. The barrier was dismantled by Filipino divers, and in response, Marcos announced even closer cooperation with the United States. The Philippines is a strategic linchpin for the U.S. in the Pacific. America's biggest weakness is the distance its forces have to travel to engage in battle. Even in a war that would take place primarily in the air and at sea, the tyranny of distance limits how long and how much the U.S. can fight. It even limits payloads on combat aircraft. However, the Philippines are less than 200 miles away from Taiwan at their nearest points, which would allow the U.S. air power to stage at Filipino airfields and run combat sorties against the Chinese ships and ground forces around or on the island. From the Philippines, U.S. air power could even regularly strike at the Chinese mainland, a critical need if the U.S. is to ensure victory over China in case of a war. Through its own bad behavior, China's ensured that the U.S. and the Philippines are closer than ever, and this has significantly weakened its own military position by doing so. As the old saying goes, China, you done played yourself. Now go check out why Russia's body armor is completely useless, or click this other video instead, if you love freedom.